Welcome to the City-REDI podcast. Today we'll be talking about productivity in the West Midlands. I'm Rebecca Riley, Associate Professor, City-REDI, WMREDI, University of Birmingham, and today we'll be talking to Charlotte Horobin, Region Director, Midlands and East of England, Make UK. Charlotte, welcome to the podcast. Please can you tell us a bit about yourself and your role?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a pleasure to be taking part in this podcast today. So I'm the Region Director across the Midlands and the East of England for Make UK, which is the national body representing manufacturers. I've got a really privileged role. I get to engage with numerous business leaders from within our manufacturing sector, understanding what their challenges are, celebrating their successes, and ultimately trying to ensure that they've got the right tools and connections in order to be more competitive and ultimately to grow.
Thanks a lot, Charlotte. This podcast is reflecting on some of the findings of a recent report looking at productivity in the West Midlands. And I suppose the first question really is, do our report findings chime with your knowledge of the manufacturing sector in the West Midlands?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's fair to say we have seen sluggish productivity growth since the financial crash 2008. The West Midlands manufacturing sector typically performs around about 6 out of 9 regions as we measure it. So absolutely kind of aligning with what we're seeing in the West Midlands, that there is more to do. But we must absolutely recognise the importance of our manufacturing sector. We always talk about manufacturers investing in a place, laying down bricks and mortar, and therefore so important to community growth and being part of a rich tapestry within a local economy. But I think the report really highlights the interconnectivity between all of the different sectors in the West Midlands, that it's not one sector is more important than the other, but rather we all need, we need accountants, we need professional services, we do need industry, we need strong schools and, excellent healthcare facilities. So for me, it just underpins how there isn't one party that is more important, but we do absolutely need to get everybody kind of hitting the right notes at the right time to unlock true growth in the region.
I think one of the findings within the report was around if the West Midlands had the same industrial structure as Great Britain, but it retained its average productivity, it would actually increase the percentage point gap in productivity. But if we kept our industrial structure, which retains that strength in manufacturing, but each industry had the same productivity as Great Britain, the gap would narrow to 1 percentage point. So what do you think that is driving that low in-firm productivity in the West Midlands that needs to be addressed?
I think there's a few things that we would point to towards productivity. Now, I must say, actually, many of our manufacturing members will say that their UK site is often the most productive, but actually the economic policies and the structure that surrounds them sometimes is what then on an international scale makes them less competitive. But focusing on the exam question of productivity, there are certain things definitely we could point to. I think we've got a cultural issue of underinvestment in the UK. So historically, what we've tended to see is that a boom in orders and the need to deliver output has often then led manufacturers to recruit people to do the jobs today, as opposed to long-term investments into digital technology that could fill that gap. With that, we've therefore got perhaps higher labour content levels than in other nations. And ultimately, for me, this comes down to leadership. And whilst it's really hard to measure leadership, it's a little bit intangible, isn't it? We do see it that actually, it's not that the UK is poor at developing leaders, but rather we've got quite a broad spectrum. So internationally, places like the US and Germany tend to have some very solid methodology in terms of developing leaders, investing in management skills. In the UK, what we tend to see is either really, really good examples or actually pretty poor examples, and not a lot of structure in between. We've also got quite complex manufacturing operations here, so we can often be producing quite complex parts. It's what we're extremely good at, typically low volume and high value. And actually, the way that services have have really kind of tagged their way into manufacturing. So rather than selling a product, you're selling, say, power by the hour or heat as a service, and making sure that that connection into the customer delivers real revenue back to the manufacturer for the long term can make the operations quite complex. Business size is also something that I'd point towards. So bigger is better. You get economies of scale. And what we have often seen is that there's a lot of support perhaps for startup scale up. And when we get our businesses to that sort, kind of what you describe in Germany, I guess, as a Mittelstand, a lot of the support can kind of tail away. So I think we perhaps need to think about the way in which we support those businesses to continue to grow. And then in sort of latter years, employee well-being and the pandemic really has put a spotlight on the healthcare and well-being of our workforce. But also the more technology we embed into businesses, that also starts to apply pressure, because where someone may have been operating a piece of kit historically, today it might be that they are responsible for a bank of equipment that's working. So hopefully that starts to just bring a few of those pillars to light as to where we might see some of the gaps in productivity creeping in.
Quite interesting that evolving of skills and requirements and within the workforce to meet the demand is quite interesting. One of the things in the report that we also found was that in the older firms are actually overrepresented in that bottom 20% of performers, and the younger firms are overrepresented in the top 20% of performers. How do you think we can help firms learn from one another within a highly competitive environment?
It's interesting, isn't it? I guess if you've got a blank sheet of paper, it's easier to lay down the plans for the future rather than trying to tinker with a structure that is already there. So I don't think that that's a surprise. We definitely find that bringing manufacturers together who can share best practice without fear of competition. So, if you've got a food and drink manufacturer, there's probably a lot they could learn from, say, an automotive supplier. That's a really brilliant way to start to win hearts and minds without fear of, pinching each other's homework. So I definitely buy into that peer-to-peer best practice sharing. And also bringing the next generation in who are digitally native, getting those guys into our businesses to perhaps get more out of software and instruments and tools that are already there, and approach things with a different point of view. Again, we've seen some really great success stories by doing that too.
Is that? I mean, you talked about the current support system being more at the early stages and that middle stage. A lot of the things that you've just described there are more at that, scale up area. Are there any other sort of recommendations for policy in that?
I think simplification and meaningful intervention is what our members would point to. Often, I don't think it's a cry out for more money, and actually free pots of stuff isn't really what our members tend to engage with. Tax breaks, tax relief, so things like R&D tax credits are particularly well used by UK manufacturing. In fact, the sector is responsible for 2/3 of business R&D. Programs like Made Smarter, again, really resonate with the sector because it's got a clear indication of what it's there to do. It's for the manufacturing sector to do things in a smarter way, to embed technology. But again, we need to make sure that we've got these programs for the long term, because as you know, Beck, all too well, our manufacturers don't operate on a 1 to 2 year cycle. Business planning is 5 to 10 years plus, looking into the future. Things like Help to Grow Digital, the scheme really means well, but a £5,000 intervention really isn't meaningful for a manufacturer. So we've got to make sure that the sector, if it is going to take its time, that it's worth the energy to do so.
Just on that, in terms of the back to the report again, there's real differences in productivity in sort of sub-regional areas. So Solihull, Warwickshire and Coventry really stand out as drivers, not only in this region, but actually nationally. Could you explore why that might be and what's driving that?
Yeah, I do think that this is a positive output from having world-class universities, but especially in the geographies that you highlight. We've, of course, got 2 amazing high-value manufacturing catapults in Warwick Manufacturing Group and also the Manufacturing Technology Centre. And then you've got this flourishing innovation community almost, being born out of engaging within the region. So I think our kind of mobility supply chain, what we'd have, I think, historically just talked about automotive, but actually the opportunity now for those businesses to be supplying aerospace, very, very light rail, automotive, that's created a really amazing melting pot with hopefully innovations that we can commercialise and capitalise to keep the manufacturing then here in the UK.
I mean, I suppose though, coming back to the earlier question about the industrial mix, there is a danger that the public policy and investment shifts our industrial mix, which could actually be negative for us in the region if we're not careful about balancing. How do you think we could drive and maintain that industrial mix?
I think we've therefore got to think about what's important to industry, and long-termism is definitely one of those things. So our members are absolutely crying out for a long-term industrial strategy. Now that I think is within the West Midlands grasp to be able to think about what that means for the region for the long term. And that really is going to be about being able to access a resilient supply of clean energy. It's really going to be about accessing skills, both an existing workforce, but also the next generation of talent that are coming through. It's going to be about having those assets to innovate. So we're blessed with amazing universities and catapult centres, as we've already highlighted. And then we've got to join up the dots so that transport and, more importantly, digital infrastructure, all very important. But we also need to make sure we've got that strategic space almost carved out for our manufacturers to be able to build purpose-built facilities, because that is an issue, trying to find economically viable and sites that can be connected up to the grid, etc., for manufacturers to come and be housed in.
And final question, really, and you've already alluded to some really good government policy, and I'm just wondering whether there are any sort of broader, wider policies or activities that government should do to facilitate growth in the West Midlands and the UK.
I think one of the key things that many business representative organisations are pointing to is the huge need to reform the apprenticeship levy and ultimately think about how we think about skills, not just for apprentices, but for the whole economy. I think as we transition to net zero and we see more digital transformation into our businesses, it's going to be really key, again, that we can upskill and cross-skill our existing workforce too. So if I were to not throw too much out there, because there's plenty to go at, but what do I think are some of the big issues there? I think being able to access skills for the future is going to be really important, and making sure that we can, again, become more resilient in terms of the type of energy that we use, and having access to that energy will be very important also.
And that, just to sort of round up, I think that the skills and the energy are big issues facing many sectors at the moment. And I think from what you've said as well, it's good to reflect that there are processes and activities and networks there that we probably need to just look at them and reform them rather than think of new ideas to tackle some of the issues. Well, thank you very much, Charlotte, for a great chat around productivity. I do think that it's a challenge at the moment after the last 3 years as well, helping the manufacturing sector to get back onto that growth pathway that we've had. And I think I agree completely with your two key areas around energy and skills supply, both of which need long-term solutions, not short-term political policies in place. So thank you very much, and hope to speak to you soon.